At 0615 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth crawled into the tail compartment of the B-17 Tondelayo at RAF Kimbolton. Outside, a dull gray English dawn spread across the airfield, one that would carry him hundreds of miles into Germany. He was 24 years old, had flown 12 combat missions, and had already been credited with 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe had positioned more than 300 fighters along the route to the target. Arooth lowered himself onto the narrow bicycle-style seat that served as his post. The tail gunner station was a cramped space, barely 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns were mounted behind him, aimed through a fragile plexiglass cone at the empty sky to the rear. At 25,000 feet, the outside temperature would plunge to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated flight suit was a thin line separating life from death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force had a name for his assignment: the loneliest job of the war. The tail gunner worked completely alone, isolated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. There was no one to talk to, no one to assist if something failed. Only a single man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe chose to throw at him. The numbers were unforgiving. By the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived just 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died at a higher rate than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots favored attacks from directly behind, and the tail position absorbed the first rounds of every assault. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in only 2 months, 90 men gone. It was a matter of geometry. German pilots knew that a rear approach gave them the longest firing opportunity. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 closing from the 6 o'clock position at 350 miles per hour had nearly 10 seconds to line up its shot before flashing past the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target whose relative speed approached 600 miles per hour. Most never had the chance. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. One short burst could shatter the plexiglass enclosure, kill the gunner, and cripple the aircraft's tail controls. A bomber without tail defense quickly became helpless. Fighters would peel away, regroup, then return to finish it off. Army Air Force's gunnery doctrine taught discipline. Wait, conserve ammunition, fire only when the enemy closed to within 300 yards. On paper, the logic was sound. In the air, 300 yards meant the enemy was already firing. By the time a tail gunner squeezed the triggers, he might already be dead. Arooth had already seen the consequences with his own eyes. On his 6th mission, a B-17 flying off Tondelayo's right wing was struck directly in the tail. The gunner never returned fire. The German fighter tore in at high speed, weapons blazing, and its opening rounds ripped through the plexiglass before the American could even respond. The bomber dropped out of formation, smoke pouring from its rear. 8 parachutes opened in the sky. The tail gunners did not. Official doctrine demanded restraint. Arooth doubted every part of it. Enemy pilots attacked from long range precisely because they knew American gunners would hesitate. The Luftwaffe had memorized the patterns. They used the training manual as if it were a guidebook. If you want to see how Arooth defied the rules that were killing tail gunners, hit the like button. It helps us uncover more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to Arooth. That morning, 186 B-17s lifted off from airfields across eastern England. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would provide escort for part of the journey, but fuel constraints meant they would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to the target alone. Arooth inspected his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun, 800 in total. The manual claimed it was sufficient for a routine mission. Arooth had already decided the manual was wrong about nearly everything. By midday, he would learn whether his judgment was correct. If it wasn't, the price would be a sealed coffin and a telegram sent to his family. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing. Through his plexiglass cone, Arooth watched the sea fade away, the white cliffs of Dover shrinking into a thin, pale streak on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, and beyond them, the core of Nazi Germany. The P-47s held position around the bomber stream. Their presence offered protection, but Arooth understood the math. The Thunderbolts carried fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flight. The mission to Kassel would last 6 hours. For most of it, the bombers would be on their own. On his early missions, Arooth had followed the rules. Wait for the fighter to close in. Take careful aim. Fire brief bursts. Save ammunition. Gunnery instructors had drilled these principles relentlessly. Ammunition was limited. Precision mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could stretch 800 rounds across an entire sortie. The doctrine assumed the enemy would play by the same rules. The Luftwaffe did not play along. German pilots had carefully analyzed American methods. They knew U.S. gunners were trained to hold fire until 300 yards, so they began shooting at twice that distance, hurling cannon shells into bomber formations while American fingers stayed off the triggers. By the time tail gunners finally opened fire, the damage had already been inflicted. Arooth approached the problem from a different angle. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It was flying directly toward him, nose on, offering the largest silhouette possible. With the rapid closing speed, the aircraft's apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who began firing early could walk his tracer rounds onto the target, correcting aim as the range collapsed. The danger, of course, was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded generous until it was divided by the number of enemy passes. A single mission could involve 15, 20, or even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the math became unforgiving. A gunner who fired early risked emptying his belts before the mission was over. Arooth accepted that risk. A gunner who conserved ammunition but was killed on the third pass had made a far worse choice. Survival depended on breaking up the attack before it could succeed. If that meant running short on bullets later, he would deal with that problem then. Ammunition held in reserve was useless to a dead man. His first real test came on his fourth mission, a June raid against the submarine pens at St. Nazaire. Two Bf-109s approached from low at the 6 o'clock position, the textbook tail attack. Standard doctrine said, "Wait." Arooth fired at 700 yards. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, dropping short first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the incoming fire and aborted his run, rolling away and diving before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither aircraft landed a hit on Tondelayo. After landing, the crew chief confronted Arooth. The ammunition tally showed nearly 200 rounds spent in a single engagement. At that rate, he would be out of ammunition long before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Arooth explained his logic. The crew chief remained unconvinced. Word of the incident spread among other tail gunners. Some called it reckless. Firing at long range violated everything the Army Air Forces taught. The manuals existed for a reason. Arooth, they said, was gambling with the lives of his crew. But Tondelayo kept making it back. Mission after mission, the bomber returned Kimbolton with its crew alive and together. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not as lucky. By mid-July, 3 bombers from a unit had been lost, taking 30 men with them. Now, on July 30th, as the formation crossed into Belgium, Arooth watched the P-47 escorts rock their wings in farewell and turn back toward England. The Thunderbolts' fuel gauges left them no choice. The bombers pushed on alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters were waiting. Arooth would need every round he carried, and he would need to stay alive long enough to fire them. The first enemy contact appeared at 11:42, climbing out of the southeast in formations of 4. Arooth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting altogether. The sky behind Tondelayo filled with yellow noses marked by black crosses. The lead fighter began its run from high at the 6 o'clock position, diving toward the bombers at nearly 400 miles per hour. Arooth followed it through his gun sight, watching the wingspan swell with every second. At 800 yards, he pressed both triggers. The twin Brownings thundered, hurling tracers into the sky. The opening rounds fell short, vanishing beneath the diving aircraft. Arooth corrected his aim, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers started to hit. Bright flashes erupted along the Messerschmitts' engine cowling. The German pilot broke sharply to the right, smoke streaming from his aircraft. He never completed the attack. The fighter corkscrewed downward and vanished into the cloud deck below. There was no time to watch. A second attacker was already closing in. This one stayed lower, attempting to slip beneath Arooth's field of fire. The angle was brutal, forcing him to depress the guns almost to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, pouring a long burst toward the oncoming fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and dumping his cannon rounds into empty sky above Tondelayo. The attacks went on for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters tore through the bomber stream, hunting damaged aircraft and those falling out of formation. Arooth fired at every target that entered his range, burning through ammunition at nearly 3 times the prescribed rate. The barrels of his guns glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29, a Bf-109 lined up directly astern, flying straight and level. The pilot possessed either exceptional bravery or very poor judgment. Arooth placed the fighter squarely in his gun sight and squeezed the triggers without letting go. The Brownings thundered for 6 uninterrupted seconds, sending more than 100 rounds into the oncoming aircraft. The Messerschmitt came apart in midair. Its engine tore free from the fuselage, the wings folding backward as the structure failed. What remained of the fighter hurtled past Tondelayo, close enough for Arooth to glimpse the empty cockpit. The pilot had either bailed out or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills. Ammunition reduced to 180 rounds. At 12:51, the formation reached Kassel and began the bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to evade while the bombardiers aligned their sights. The Luftwaffe knew this was the moment of greatest vulnerability. Their fighters surged forward with renewed aggression. A Focke-Wulf 190 plunged toward Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock position. Arooth swung his guns and fired a brief burst. The round struck the fighter's wing root, but the pilot kept coming. Cannon shells ripped through Tondelayo's tail. Arooth felt the impacts before he registered the pain. 20-millimeter fragments tore through the plexiglass, shredding his heated suit and driving into his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. Arooth continued firing with the right gun alone, one-handed, bleeding heavily. He tracked the damaged Focke-Wulf as it tried to disengage. A final burst slammed into the fighter's tail section. The aircraft snap-rolled and plunged earthward. His third kill of the mission. The intercom erupted with voices. Someone asked about damage. Another crewman called out flak ahead. Arooth tried to answer, but his mouth was dry and unresponsive. Blood pooled on the floor of the compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds fired, 63 remaining, 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only halfway complete. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England, running the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the inbound leg. Arooth wrapped a scarf tightly around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. The return leg began at 13:04. Tondelayo turned west with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a towering column of black smoke. Arooth stayed at his post, scanning the sky through plexiglass smeared with blood. The Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, repositioning themselves along the bomber stream's path to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those destroyed or damaged earlier that day. The second gauntlet proved just as lethal as the first. Arooth's left arm had gone numb from a combination of cold and blood loss. His jam gun was beyond use. The feed system had been destroyed by the same cannon round that wounded him. He now had a single working weapon, and only 63 rounds to protect Tondelayo across 250 miles of hostile airspace. The math forced a new strategy. With 63 rounds left, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of roughly 20 rounds each. Every squeeze of the trigger had to matter. There would be no more suppressive fire. At 13:31, 2 Bf-109s approached from the 7 o'clock position. Arooth waited until the range closed to 500 yards, then fired a carefully aimed 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers punched into the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dived away, a stream of glycol coolant trailing behind it. The wingman abandoned the attack without firing, 51 rounds remaining. Tondelayo crossed back into France at 14:15. Enemy attacks thinned as the Luftwaffe reached the edge of an effective range. By 14:47, the bomber stream had left the final German interceptors behind. 20 minutes later, the English Channel came into view. The landing at Kimbolton occurred at 15:52. Arooth was unable to climb out of the tail compartment on his own. Ground crew members pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon later counted 11 separate fragment wounds in his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Word spread quickly through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within hours, it was known that Tondelayo's tail gunner had destroyed 3 enemy fighters and damaged 2 more while wounded, operating a single gun with only 63 rounds of ammunition. The mission intelligence report cited his early engagement firing technique as a key factor in the aircraft's survival. Other tail gunners began to question established doctrine. The manual said, wait until 300 yards. Arooth had fired at 800. The doctrine emphasized conserving ammunition. Arooth had expended over 700 rounds before being hit. The doctrine produced dead gunners. Arooth had lived. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer reviewed the gun camera footage from Tondelayo's mission. The film showed Arooth's tracers reaching far beyond standard engagement distances, breaking up attack runs before German pilots could establish accurate firing solutions. Early fire forced enemy aircraft to maneuver, reducing their accuracy and limiting damage to the bomber. By mid-August, 3 additional tail gunners in the squadron had adopted modified versions of Arooth's method. Survival rates began to rise. Bombers guarded by these gunners returned with noticeably less damage. The connection was impossible to dismiss. On September 1st, the commander of the 379th Bombardment Group received an initial assessment. The findings indicated that aggressive, early engagement reduced bomber losses by breaking up coordinated fighter attacks. The conclusion directly challenged 2 years of accepted gunnery doctrine. While these conclusions circulated, Arooth was recovering in the station hospital. The shrapnel wounds had narrowly missed major arteries and nerve pathways. On August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission, the flight surgeon cleared him to return to flight status. Tondelayo was waiting for him in a new form. The original aircraft had been struck from service. Its accumulated battle damage judged too extensive to justify repair. The replacement bomber carried the same name and the same crew. On August 26, Arooth once again climbed into the tail position. The Luftwaffe had begun to sense that something had changed within American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers started examining the pattern. By early September, Luftwaffe analysts identified the shift. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, in some cases at distances beyond 600 yards. This new behavior disrupted attack methods that had been effective for months. German pilots reported the change during post-mission debriefings across occupied Europe. The 6 o'clock approach, once the safest and most reliable angle against B-17 formations, was growing increasingly hazardous. Tracer fire reached out before pilots could establish stable firing solutions. The psychological impact was substantial. Even when rounds fell short, seeing tracers streaming toward an aircraft at long range triggered instinctive evasive maneuvers. The Luftwaffe responded tactically in 3 stages. First, they increased closing speeds, diving at bomber formations at maximum velocity to minimize exposure time. Second, they altered approach geometry, favoring high 6 o'clock attacks where gravity aided their escape. Third, they began singling out bombers that appeared to have especially aggressive gunners, attempting to neutralize the threat before the tactics spread. None of these adjustments resolved the core issue. Higher speed attacks reduced exposure, but they also reduced accuracy. Steeper attack angles made it harder for gunners to track fighters through the dive. Targeting aggressive tail gunners required identifying them beforehand, an almost impossible task amid the confusion of an ongoing air battle. Between August 26th and September 5th, the 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions. Arooth took part in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed victories to his tally. Other tail gunners in the group accounted for 7 additional kills. The Luftwaffe's loss rate against the Triangle K bombers continued to rise. German fighter commanders responded by attempting to mass their attacks. Rather than distributing interceptors across the entire bomber stream, they concentrated forces against individual groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire with sheer numbers. This approach succeeded on September 3rd, when a focus assault on the 100 Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in just 15 minutes. The 379th avoided that fate by occupying a different position within the combat box. Even so, the lesson was unmistakable. The Luftwaffe was adapting, probing for weaknesses in the new defensive methods. The air war over Europe had evolved into a battle of tactical innovation, with each side analyzing the other's techniques and developing counters. Arooth understood what was at stake. His method worked because it caught the enemy off guard. Once the Germans devised effective responses, that advantage would vanish. Every mission became an experiment. Every engagement produced data both sides would study. The edge provided by aggressive early fire was shrinking week by week. The mission schedule for September 6 targeted Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers more than 500 miles through enemy airspace, the deepest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence forecasts warned of heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart was a major producer of ball bearings, components vital to virtually every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German war machine. Its strategic value made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Flak batteries surrounded the city, and fighter units were stationed along every likely approach corridor. The briefing on September 5th laid out the challenge in stark terms. The 379th was assigned the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming for every formation following behind. Flying lead meant taking the first fighter attacks. It meant holding straight and level while other groups maneuvered around them. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could bring to bear. That evening, Arooth inspected his guns. Both Brownings had been freshly serviced. The feed systems ran smoothly, and the barrels had been replaced after reaching their round limits. He loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The extra weight slowed the aircraft slightly, but firepower mattered more than performance. The next day would test every lesson he had learned. It would decide whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 5:40 on September 6. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, assembling over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element of the 379 formation, place where Arooth would face the first attacks from any direction. Enemy fighters intercepted them over France at 9:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lifted off from airfields across the region, climbing hard to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace. The opening attacks came from the 11 o'clock position, head-on passes aimed at the nose gunners rather than the tail. Arooth waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was massing its strength, merging fighters from multiple units into a single striking force. By 9:40, intelligence estimates placed more than 100 interceptors, shadowing the bombers. Rear attacks began at 10:08. A staffel of 12 Bf-109s formed up 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled into a climbing assault from low 6 o'clock. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards, throwing tracers into the lead element. 2 fighters immediately broke away. A third took multiple hits and peeled off trailing smoke. The remaining 9 pressed in. Cannon fire tore through the formation, striking bombers throughout the 379 combat box. B-17 flying off Tondelayo's left wing took damage to its number 3 engine. Another aircraft in the low squadron began leaking fuel from ruptured tanks. Arooth continued firing, shifting rapidly from one target to the next as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter ticked steadily downward. 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attack showed no sign of slowing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 plunged down on Tondelayo from high and directly astern, using the sun to conceal its approach. Arooth saw the fighter a moment too late. 20mm shells tore into the tail before he could swing his guns. The impact slammed him against the plexiglass. His left gun was obliterated. its receiver shattered by a direct hit. Shrapnel ripped through his heated suit, opening fresh wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood streamed into his eyes, blurring his vision. He kept firing with the right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up and rolled away, smoke trailing from damage inflicted during the dive. Arooth wiped the blood from his eyes and searched for the next threat. Tondelayo was in mortal trouble. Cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, damaged tail control surfaces, and punctured fuel tanks near the wing roots. The pilots fought to hold altitude, but the bomber was losing the fight against gravity and drag. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tondelayo stayed in position just long enough to release its bombs over the target, then dropped out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. Two engines were running unevenly. Fuel levels were dangerously low. The decision was made over eastern France. Tondelayo could not make it back to England. The only viable option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might reach the crew before exposure proved fatal. Arooth stayed at his post as the bomber descended, scanning the sky for fighters that might finish off the crippled aircraft. None appeared. The Luftwaffe had turned its attention to healthier bombers still holding formation. Tondelayo struck the channel at 15:12, slamming into the gray water at roughly 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Arooth was hurled forward, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness. When he came to, he was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were already closing in. All 10 crewmen had survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions now rested on the bottom of the English Channel. The commander of the 379th Bombardment Group was already requesting Arooth's mission reports. On October 14, 1943, the Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived. The United States Army's second highest military decoration formally recognized Arooth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation explicitly highlighted his choice to keep firing despite his wounds, noting that his defensive fire protected the bomber during its most critical moments. By late October, the 8th Air Force's gunnery staff had completed a comprehensive review. The study examined data from 14 bomber groups over 3 months of combat operations. Their findings overturned assumptions that had shaped American air combat doctrine since 1942. Tail gunners who opened fire at ranges beyond 500 yards demonstrated significantly higher survival rates than those who adhered strictly to established procedures. Early engagement disrupted enemy attack patterns, forcing German pilots into evasive maneuvers instead of allowing them to settle into stable firing positions. The expenditure of ammunition was heavy, but the exchange favored aggression over restraint. General Frederick Anderson, who oversaw operational planning for the 8th Bomber Command, personally examined the results. What emerged went far beyond the actions of a single aircraft. The evidence suggested that if several bombers opened coordinated defensive fire early, they could break up concentrated fighter assaults. Such a possibility challenged the foundations of existing defensive doctrine. In November, this reassessment led to an official policy shift. Updated gunnery instructions permitted tail gunners to fire at enemy aircraft from greater distances when circumstances allowed. Though the directive was framed in careful bureaucratic terms, its intent was unmistakable. The method that had once kept Arooth alive was now being institutionalized. Arooth himself never witnessed the full impact of the new doctrine. Injuries sustained during the Stuttgart ditching were far more severe than doctors initially believed. Although he returned to operational status in late September, he flew only 3 more missions before being permanently removed from combat duty. Persistent headaches and visual disturbances made further flying unsafe. His final record listed 17 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, along with 4 additional claims still under review. This score placed him among the top-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some accounts attributed as many as 19 victories to him, but gaps and inconsistencies in wartime records prevented absolute certainty. Following the Distinguished Service Cross, Arooth received the Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized the accumulation of his combat service, while the Purple Heart marked the wounds he had suffered. By the end of his flying career, his list of decorations exceeded that of most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued flying combat missions for another year and a half, enduring the winter of 1943, the invasion campaigns of 1944, and the final offensives of 1945. Meanwhile, the tactics Arooth had helped develop spread across the 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners throughout the force began applying versions of early engagement firing practices. The effects became visible only over time. Bomber losses steadily decreased through 1944, although no single factor could explain the improvement. The arrival of long-range fighter escorts reduced the period bombers flew unprotected, while ongoing upgrades to aircraft design and onboard systems further increased their chances of survival. Defensive gunnery is overall improvement ka ek important hissada, or zayat aggressive firing ki taraf jo shift hua, us is process ko or strong benaya. German fighter pilots any is badlav ko jaldi messus karlia. Paktige Luftwaffe aircrew ku interrogation reports main American bomber formations ku pitchel his son par hamlakarna peli esi kafi, zayat katarnak batayagaya. Joe Asanchakar Shiru Kador main bomber interceptions Kuwak Miljate the Wo Dear Mushkilot Chelge. Is Waja Southeast Kutch German pilots any apney strategy Betel D or Puri Terra head on attacks par shift Hoge. Wo Zayata closure speed or risk KO except car Rahide. Surface slide Taki rear hemisphere Siane Wali concentrated defensive fire SE Boxaken. Arooth KO early 1944 Maine United States Wapas Bej Diagaya. Army Air Forces any training role main assign Kia. Jahan Unka combat experience ne gunners tak Panche Gaya Joe. Overseas deployment Kalia Tayarho Rahida. Yun Kabaki Salan Hon Dusran Ko Wai techniques. CK Hugazare Jocut Unkeys and Dagi Bashane main Manajar Hiti. Training Esi Gazarn Wales students any Tariq Germany Kwazmanen tak. Japan Kuyuper or Horace Theater tak. Legay Jahan American bombers, KO enemy fighters Ka Samnakar Napada. Yung Kabad Arooth any Joe Faisalia, Asan Sab KO Herring Kardia Joe Ani Janida. Michael Arooth any war Kakadam Hon Kabad military service Chadan Ka Rasta Nahichana. 1947 main unhon newly established United States Air Force join key, or Eagle 15 Sol Tax Service Jari Rocky. The man who survived the most dangerous skies over Europe continued to wear the uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. For many people, this decision was difficult to understand. Arooth had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice, had ditched in the English Channel, and had faced death so many times that even official records cannot fully account for them. Most veterans with such experiences wanted nothing more than a quiet civilian life. But Arooth saw things differently. The Air Force had given him a sense of purpose during the darkest days of the century. The skills he developed did not only save his own life. They saved the lives of the crews he flew with and the gunners who learned from his methods. Walking away from all that felt to him like abandoning something deeply important. His post-war life was relatively quiet. He married, raised a family, and spoke very little about his combat experiences. His medals remained locked away in a drawer. The memories stayed buried in his mind. Like many veterans of his generation, Arooth believed that those who were not there could never fully understand. Elmer Bendiner, the navigator Tondelayo, chose a very different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing the memoir The Fall of Fortresses. The book documented the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. Bendiner's writing ensured that Tondelayo and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group organized reunions for decades after the war, keeping alive both the men and the memories of that era. At these gatherings, veterans came together to remember friends who never returned home, to share stories their families had never heard, and to honor the young men they once were. Whenever his health allowed, Arooth attended these reunions, reconnecting with survivors from those terrifying months over Europe. On February 20th, 1990, his remains were laid to rest at the National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona. He had passed away 5 days earlier, on February 15th, in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. His gravestone lists only his rank, his branch of service, and the name of his war. It does not mention the 17 enemy fighters he shot down, the bomber crews he saved, or how he helped change an entire defensive doctrine. Military cemeteries are filled with such silent statements. Stone records names and dates, but it cannot convey the weight, the stories, or the sacrifices behind those names. Arooth rests among thousands of other veterans, each with a story worth hearing. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England into combat. The records of the 379th Bombardment Group are safeguarded there as well, including mission reports that document Arooth's combat achievements. Researchers can still trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through those files, documents in which Arooth's influence is clearly visible. Today, the tail gunner position on aircraft no longer exists. The planes that carried men like Arooth into combat now live mostly in museums and memorial displays. But the principles he proved, the importance of aggressive action over passive defense, and the courage to challenge doctrines that were costing lives, remain very much alive. If this story moved you as deeply as it moved us, please take a moment to press the like button. Every like signals YouTube that this story deserves to reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every day, we bring stories like this out of forgotten archives. Stories of tail gunners who saved their crews through courage and clear thinking. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States? The United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community spans the globe. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know that you were here. Thank you for watching and for helping ensure that the name Michael Arooth is not lost to silence. This man deserves to be remembered, and you are helping keep that memory alive.